The heavy oak door of the county jail rattled as 3 lead bullets punched clean through the wood. Dust and splinters rained down on the cold stone floor, where Sheriff Cole lay clutching his bleeding thigh. Outside, the harsh laughter of the Blackwood gang echoed through the empty, terrified streets of Oakhaven. Every single deputy had already broken and run, leaving their silver stars shining in the dirt like worthless tin. Sarah stood over the bleeding lawman, her breath coming in short, heavy gasps that strained the fabric of her worn dress. Just an hour ago, the town women had stood on the bakery porch, loudly mocking her large, full-figured frame as she hauled flour sacks. They whispered that a woman of her immense size belonged in a barn, not a proper town, laughing behind their gloved hands. Now those same dainty women were hiding under their beds, while Sarah was the only thing standing between the outlaws and the town's keys.
Sheriff Cole groaned, his face pale as milk, his calloused hand slipping from his slick, bloody wound. He looked up at Sarah with hollow eyes, trying to wave her away toward the back exit of the building. "Go, Sarah," the lawman grunted, his voice cracking as more gunfire shattered the glass of the front window. "They are going to tear this place apart to get their leader out of the cellar cell." Sarah did not move an inch, her thick leather boots planted firmly on the floor like roots of an ancient tree. She reached down, grabbed the collar of Cole's heavy wool coat, and pulled him back into the shadows of the office. With one massive, deliberate heave of her powerful arms, she dragged the 200-pound lawman behind the safety of the brick hearth. Cole gasped, staring up at her in utter disbelief as she wiped the sweat and black gunpowder from her forehead. She didn't say a word, her jaw set tight as she reached for the long, heavy double-barrel shotgun leaning against the desk. The weapon felt solid and natural in her large, capable hands, a stark contrast to the delicate teacups the town ladies said she should be holding. Another boot kicked violently against the front door, making the iron hinges groan under the immense pressure. "We know you're alone in there, lawman," a raspy voice shouted from the dusty street outside. "Throw out the keys to the cell, or we burn this entire office down with you inside it." Sarah cocked both hammers of the shotgun, the dual metallic clicks sounding incredibly loud in the cramped, smoky room. Before we reveal the shocking words she whispered through the door that changed her life forever, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of this legendary frontier tale. She stepped directly into the line of fire, leveling the heavy barrels right at the splintering center of the wooden door. "If you want the keys to this jail, outlaw, you'll have to carry them past me first," Sarah bellowed back. The heavy boots on the porch went completely silent for 3 long seconds as the outlaws absorbed her words. Then, a chorus of cruel, mocking laughter erupted from the dusty street, cutting through the tense afternoon heat. "That's just the big cook girl, boys," the raspy voice shouted, followed by the sound of spitting on the wooden boards. "She's got more meat on her bones than brains in her head, so just blast right through the pine." Sarah didn't blink, her grip tightening around the walnut stock of the shotgun until her knuckles turned white. She had spent 3 long years in Oakhaven listening to that exact same tone from every storekeeper and salon lady. When she arrived in town, the local mercantiler refused to measure her for a Sunday dress, claiming it was a waste of good fabric. He told her right to her face that his scales weren't meant for weighing cattle, laughing as the other customers stared. Sarah had kept her head down back then, swallowing the bitter humiliation because she needed the meager coins from the jailhouse kitchen. She washed the grease, baked the heavy loaves of bread, and carried 40-pound water buckets daily while the town sneered at her gait. They called her a mountain of a woman, a clumsy giantess who would never find a man willing to look past her heavy curves. Even the local pastor's wife had suggested she eat her meals in the pantry so she wouldn't offend the eyes of the congregation. Now, those same judgmental townspeople were locked in their cellars, praying that the big cook girl would save their lives. Sheriff Cole watched her from his spot on the floor, his breathing ragged as a dark pool of blood expanded beneath his thigh. He could see the trembling of her faded cotton skirt, but her arms remained as steady as the iron bars of the cells. "They don't know you, Sarah," Cole whispered, his voice trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 spare brass shells. "They think you're just a servant, but I've seen you work until midnight without a single word of complaint." Sarah took the extra shells without breaking her gaze from the door, dropping them into the deep apron pocket covering her wide hips. She knew the town thought she was nothing, a lonely creature destined to die old and forgotten in a rented shack. But as the first outlaw threw his entire weight against the front door, Sarah felt a strange, cold calmness settle over her soul. The wood cracked violently, a large split appearing right down the center of the heavy oak frame. Through the gap, she could see the filthy leather vest and the glinting silver buckle of the man trying to force his way inside. He didn't see the massive double barrels pointing directly at his chest through the splintered opening. Sarah took one step forward, her heavy frame shifting the floorboards as she prepared to give Oakhaven something new to talk about. The outlaw outside gave another savage kick, slamming his boot directly against the weakened center of the oak door. The wood gave way with a loud crack, revealing his dirty face and a cruel, jagged grin beneath his sweaty Stetson. Before his boot could even touch the indoor floor, Sarah squeezed the front trigger of the heavy double-barrel shotgun. The roar of the weapon was deafening in the small room, unleashing a cloud of thick white smoke that blinded everyone. The blast caught the outlaw square in his chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the dusty street. He didn't make a sound as he hit the dirt, his revolver spinning away into the weeds across the road. The remaining outlaws on the porch screamed in shock, scrambling backward toward the hitching posts for cover. Sarah didn't hesitate for a single second, stepping forward into the swirling smoke to slam the broken door shut. She reached down and grabbed a heavy 100-pound sack of rock salt from the corner, hoisting it with one fluid motion. Her breath came hard, her fuller figure moving with a fierce, surprising agility that the townspeople never thought possible. She slammed the massive sack against the base of the door, completely blocking the lower gap. Then she turned to the solid oak desk, a massive piece of furniture that usually required 3 grown men to shift across the room. Sarah dug her heels into the floorboards, pressed her wide hips against the wood, and shoved with every ounce of her strength. The heavy desk groaned and slid across the room, wedging itself tightly against the center of the splintered entryway. Sheriff Cole watched from the floor, his jaw dropping in absolute awe as he saw her handle the weight like it was nothing. The town always said her large body was a curse, but right now, that physical power was the only shield keeping them alive. Outside, the outlaws opened fire again, their rifle bullets thudding harmlessly into the thick oak desk and the stone walls. Sarah ignored the lead whistling through the air, kneeling down beside the bleeding lawman without a trace of fear in her eyes. She grabbed her thick cotton apron, tearing a long, wide strip of the heavy fabric with a sharp, decisive snap of her hands. "We need to stop this bleeding, Sheriff," she said, her voice remarkably calm as she pressed her palms against his wound. Cole winced, his hand coming up to touch her arm, his fingers brushing against her skin with a gentleness he had never shown before. "You should have run when you had the chance, Sarah," he murmured, his pale lips barely moving as the pain tore through him. "They won't stop until they take this town down, and you shouldn't be dying for a place that treated you like garbage." Sarah looked down at his silver star, then into his honest gray eyes, tightening the makeshift bandage around his leg. "I'm not dying for this town, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice fierce as she grabbed the second shotgun shell from her pocket. "I'm standing right here for you." The outlaw leader outside roared in fury, his voice carrying over the sound of continuous rifle fire. Bullets smashed into the window frames, showering Sarah and the sheriff with sharp fragments of glass. Sarah stayed low, her large frame protecting Cole completely as she snapped the shotgun shut with 2 fresh shells inside. For the next 2 hours, the small jailhouse became a blazing furnace of black powder, smoke, and sheer determination.
Every time an outlaw tried to peek around the window casing, Sarah unleashed a devastating roar from her weapon. Her shoulders ached from the brutal recoil, and her ears rang with a constant deafening buzz. But she didn't flinch. her heavy boots remaining firmly planted in the growing pile of spent brass casings. Cole managed to sit up against the brick hearth, using his repeating rifle to fire through the lower gaps in the barricade. Between shots, his eyes constantly drifted back to Sarah, tracking the fierce beauty of her untamed spirit. He saw the sweat trickling down her neck, the dirt on her round cheeks, and the absolute defiance in her eyes. Suddenly, a loud trumpet blast echoed from the eastern ridge of the valley, cutting through the gunfire. The U.S. cavalry had finally arrived, their horses thundering down the main street like a wave of righteous iron.
The remaining outlaws panicked, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the hills before the soldiers could surround them. Within minutes, the terrifying noise of the siege vanished, replaced by the shouts of soldiers and the murmurs of townspeople. The heavy oak desk was pushed aside from the outside, and several blue-coated soldiers rushed into the smoky room. Right behind them came the mayor and the town women, their faces pale as they looked at the destruction. They stared at Sarah in stunned silence, their eyes wide as they saw the empty shotgun in her massive hands. The pastor's wife opened her mouth to speak, but Sheriff Cole cut her off, hoisting himself up with the help of a young captain. He didn't look at the mayor, and he didn't look at the soldiers. His gaze was locked entirely on Sarah. "Get my horse," Cole ordered the captain, his voice carrying a cold, unquestionable authority that made the room freeze. "I am leaving this office today, and I am taking the only true soul in this entire wretched town with me." He turned to Sarah, extending a bloody but steady hand toward her, his eyes softening completely. "Come with me to the Valley Ranch, Sarah," Cole said softly, ignoring the gasps of the surrounding crowd. "You saved my life, and I will not let you spend another day serving people who aren't worthy to breathe your air." The heavy leather reins of the sheriff's finest carriage felt smooth in Sarah's hands as they crossed the high ridge. Behind them, the toxic, whispering streets of Oakhaven faded into a harmless smudge of dust against the horizon. Sheriff Cole lay back against the cushioned seat, his bandaged leg propped up on a soft wool blanket she had found in his quarters. The high valley sun caught the sharp angles of his jaw, softening the hard lines that years of dealing with lawbreakers had carved into his face.
As the carriage rolled through the massive timber gates of the Whispering Pines Ranch, Sarah pulled the horses to a gentle stop. This was Cole's private sanctuary, a vast emerald empire of rich grass and fat cattle tucked safely away from the world. The air here smelled different, clean, sweet, and entirely free of the bitter judgment that had suffocated her for 3 long years. Cole carefully swung his good leg over the side of the carriage, refusing the help of his arriving ranch hands with a sharp wave of his hand. He turned to Sarah, his gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You're safe here, Sarah," Cole said, his voice deep and steady as he reached out to clasp her large, warm hand. "This land is mine, which means everything on it answers to me, and no one will ever look down on you under this roof." Sarah looked down at her faded, grease-stained dress, suddenly very aware of how her full, heavy figure filled the carriage seat.
She had spent so long being told she was too big, too clumsy, and too much for a normal house, let alone a grand estate like this. "Are you sure about this, Sheriff?" she whispered, her fingers trembling slightly within his firm, calloused grip. "The people in town, they will talk about a man of your standing bringing a woman like me to his home." Cole's grip tightened, his thumb gently tracing the back of her knuckles as a rare, fierce smile touched his lips. "Let them talk until their throats turn to dust, because I have never seen a lady in town with half your courage or half your beauty." He leaned in closer, the scent of leather and cedar wood surrounding her as he looked straight into her uncertain soul. "I don't want a fragile porcelain doll who hides in the cellar when the world gets loud, Sarah. I want the woman who stood like an iron wall beside me, and I want to know if you will stay by my side as the mistress of this ranch."
The very next morning, Sheriff Cole's heavy black carriage rattled to a halt directly in front of Oakhaven's finest mercantile store. The storekeeper, a lean man named Miller who had mocked Sarah's size just days prior, stepped onto the porch with a nervous, trembling smile. Cole stepped down from the carriage first, his bandaged leg causing him to lean heavily on a polished silver cane, but his eyes were cold as winter ice. He reached into his pocket and slammed a heavy, jingling leather pouch filled with solid gold coins onto the wooden counter. "I want every single roll of the finest silk, velvet, and imported linen you have in this shop," Cole said, his voice echoing through the store. Miller blinked, looking past the lawman toward the carriage where Sarah sat, her full, voluptuous figure dressed in her usual worn cotton. "But Sheriff, we don't carry garments in her unique size," Miller stammered, his eyes darting down to avoid Cole's deadly gaze.
Cole took a step forward, the tip of his silver cane sinking deeply into the floorboards as he leaned into the storekeeper's face. "Then you will hire the best tailor in the territory to come to my ranch and custom sew every single stitch to fit her perfectly," Cole growled. "Every curve, every inch of her magnificent frame will be covered in the richest fabrics your meager coin can buy from the East." Sarah watched from the carriage, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw the arrogant storekeeper bow his head in absolute submission. Never in her life had a man stood up for her like this, shielding her from the cruel judgments of the world with his own power. An hour later, back in the quiet parlor of the ranch house, the private tailor was already measuring her full hips and round shoulders with trembling tape. Sarah looked down at the floor, her cheeks flushing red with a sudden painful wave of her old, familiar insecurity.
"Don't you dare look down, Sarah," Cole murmured, walking over to push the tailor aside with a quiet, dismissive nod. He took both of her large, soft hands in his own, looking up into her eyes with an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion. "Those women in town are like fragile twigs that a strong autumn wind could snap in half," Cole said, his voice dropping to a fierce, tender whisper. "But you are built like the very mountains that protect this valley, beautiful, powerful, and absolutely breathtaking to look at." He gently traced the curve of her soft, full jawline, his rough fingers making her skin tingle with a warmth she had never known. For the first time in her life, looking into the mirror of Cole's honest eyes, Sarah didn't feel like an outcast. She felt like a queen. 3 nights later, a fierce summer storm rolled over the valley, drowning the ranch in sheets of blinding rain and roaring thunder.
Inside the main house, the oil lamps flickered softly, casting long shadows across the heavy timber walls of the bedroom. Sarah woke with a sudden start, her sharp senses catching a sound that didn't belong to the howling wind outside. It was the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle lever being thrown out near the dark, shadowy edge of the stables. She slipped out of bed, her full, magnificent frame moving silently through the dark hallway toward the front parlor. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw 3 cloaked figures creeping toward the porch, their faces hidden by low-brimmed hats. It was the surviving members of the Blackwood gang, back to seek a bloody revenge on the lawman who had broken their spirit. Sarah didn't scream. She walked straight to the hearth and grabbed Cole's heavy Winchester rifle, racking a cartridge into the chamber. Cole was awake an instant later, his boots thudding on the floor as he limped into the room, his revolver already drawn. "Stay behind the brick wall, Sarah," Cole commanded in a tense whisper, but she simply shook her head and stepped up beside him. "I told you before, Sheriff, I am not a woman who hides in the shadows while others fight her battles," she whispered fiercely. She knelt by the windowsill, her wide shoulders providing a rock-solid support for the heavy barrel of the repeating rifle. The front door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and the lead outlaw lunged into the dark room, his gun flashing. Sarah pulled the trigger before he could aim, the rifle roaring as the bullet tore through his shoulder and knocked him backward. Cole fired 2 rapid shots right over her head, dropping the second intruder squarely on the threshold of the porch. The last outlaw panicked, turning to run back into the torrential rain, but Cole's hand stopped him dead in his tracks. The lawman strode out into the storm, his silver cane forgotten as he dragged the screaming criminal into the mud by his collar. Under the flashing lightning, Cole looked like a vengeful god of the frontier, his face hardened into a mask of pure fury. "You dared to bring your filth to my land, and you dared to threaten the woman I love, Cole roared over the thunder. He delivered a brutal, bone-crushing blow with the butt of his revolver, knocking the outlaw completely unconscious into the dirt. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her custom-made silk dress soaking in the rain, clinging beautifully to every deep curve of her body. Cole turned around and saw her standing there, looking like a fierce goddess of the storm, entirely unbothered by the violence. He walked up the steps, his wet hands coming up to cradle her round, beautiful face as the rain poured over them both. "No one will ever bring harm to you again, Sarah," Cole vowed, his voice thick with an absolute, undeniable devotion. "Tomorrow, this whole territory will know exactly who rules this ranch and who holds the keys to my entire life." The midday sun beat down on the dusty center of Oakhaven as the sheriff's black carriage rolled into the town square. The clatter of iron wheels silenced the bustling market, bringing the merchants and townswomen to a complete halt. Sarah stepped down first, her hand resting gracefully on the carriage door, her silhouette striking against the bright horizon. She wore a custom-made gown of deep, midnight blue silk, expertly tailored to celebrate every proud, full curve of her body. The fabric shined like water, emphasizing the narrowness of her waist and the regal fullness of her hips. The pastor's wife, who had once told Sarah to eat in the pantry, dropped her basket of apples, her face turning pale as she stared. Sarah held her head high, her eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, unshakable confidence that had been absent just a week ago. Sheriff Cole followed her, his stride slow and deliberate, his silver star glinting sharply on his chest. He didn't look at the storekeeper, and he didn't look at the mayor. His attention was fixed solely on the woman at his side. They reached the center of the square, where the wooden platform of the town gallows stood as a grim reminder of justice. Cole stopped in front of the gathered crowd, his voice booming with a calm, terrifying authority that hushed the wind. "For 3 years, this town treated a good woman like a burden because she did not fit your narrow, fragile view of beauty," he stated. He unpinned the silver star from his chest, turning it over in his calloused fingers as the crowd held its collective breath. "I gave my life to protect a town that had no honor, but tonight I resign from the service of people who possess no heart." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the heavy star into the dirt, where it landed face down in the dust. He took Sarah's hand in his, raising it for everyone to see, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fire.
"This woman did not just save my life, she saved my soul. And she is the true queen of my heart and my land." He pulled a massive diamond ring from his pocket, sliding it onto her finger until it caught the light, sparkling with impossible brilliance. Sarah looked at the townspeople, the same people who had mocked her, and saw nothing but shame and wonder in their eyes. She felt no anger, only a profound, crystalline peace, knowing that she had won the only battle that ever truly mattered. The ranch was waiting, and for the first time, she knew exactly what it felt like to be loved for every single inch of who she was. Cole bowed his head to her, a gesture of absolute public devotion that shattered every barrier between them. The town of Oakhaven watched in silence as the former cook walked away, arm in arm with the most powerful man in the territory. They were finally together, safe within the sanctuary of the ranch, never to be touched by the judgment of the world again. If you were in Sarah's place, would you forgive the townspeople who mocked you, or would you make them watch as you built a new life without them?